Okay, so maybe you thought, what on earth do I mean the lifetime allowance is not dead? I thought it was abolished.
Said I will go further and abolish the lifetime allowance altogether.
Well, look, despite the headlines, it is by no means as simple as saying everything's done. And while in general, I do think the changes are quite positive, it's not the case it's done and dusted. And anyone who's got a pension over, I'd say about 500,000 on the build up to retirement, you probably need to get a handle of these rules. And you might have thought when you heard, oh, the lifetime allowance is abolished, I bet loads of advisors are going to have less to do now. You couldn't be more wrong. There is, as always, a ton of complexity that we need to try and navigate to get through on these rules. They're potentially simpler end result, perhaps, but you need to be really careful. And if you've got a larger pension and maybe you don't understand the rules, it could lead to higher taxation. So I'm going to tell you in this video the changes that you might need to navigate, including one point about getting potentially higher tax-free cash with a certificate that no one tells you about, another which seems to be a huge loophole that I'm frankly very surprised about. Okay, so let's recap. So the way that the lifetime allowance used to work was on a basis of what's called benefit crystallization events, which is a very fancy way of saying, look, when you take your benefits, this is when we test it, and that's how we know how much pension you've used against the lifetime allowance. Okay, so kind of imagine that this jar is your lifetime allowance, and every time you have a benefit crystallization event, you use some of everything. And at some point that will get filled up. I probably should have used sand, but I don't have sand. So anyway, you kind of get the point, and then you've used it all. Anyway, if you want a recap, you can watch my older videos on this. And the lifetime allowance was acting kind of as a ceiling limit for what you could put in a pension. And there were various testing points. One was when you took benefits, the other when you reached 75, and another when you died. And some slightly more unusual ones, which I'm not going to mention. Anyway, then this happened.
Tax reform.
So the first thing I want to try and do here is just manage expectations with how complicated it is when things like this change in the pension world. The original consultation for the lifetime allowance and to abolish it was 40 pages. The bill is over 100. There's a lot there. There's also precedence in pension legislation for it to take a good amount of time to iron out these changes. And there are some bits which still do need clarification. So what was called A-Day, way back when, was actually put forward in the Finance Act of 2004, but it came into place on the 6th of April 2006. So things aren't just going to be simple on the other side. There's lots of transitional rules we need to try and navigate, as well as some really quirky ones that have come about from this legislative change. There we go, said it eventually. And of course, I can't cover everything in a short video. No joke, it would take hours to go through everything. I've tried to filter through what is most useful, but always make sure you get advice specific to you before acting, because this is only really high level. Okay, so the key facts. What's the difference? Well, under the new regime, only lump sums are tested. So all benefit crystallization events around income and the ones that happen around 75 are removed. And there is now two new allowances. One is a lump sum allowance, or a tax-free cash allowance for non-finance people, set at, if you've got no protections, 268,275, and then a lump sum and death benefit allowance set at the old lifetime allowance of 1,073,100. Again, assuming you've not got protections. There is also, though, this new thing called an overseas transfer allowance of, again, 1,073,100. And I'm going to come back to that later. And look, I think we all have to understand that for pension scheme administrators, this is going to be a bit of a nightmare to try and navigate these rules and the information we're going to need. So, okay, so we've got some new allowances. When are these new allowances tested? Well, look, if someone now takes a lump sum from their pension, the tax-free cash element is going to be tested against the lump sum allowance. What is really interesting under the current legislation is that the lump sum or the tax-free cash, which was set at 268,275, actually has no provisions in the legislation for index linking. And why might that matter to me? Well, I can't get access to my pension for 20 years or so. So if inflation, say 3% over that time, does that mean, adjusting for inflation, that I only get about 145 grand tax-free cash in real terms?
Don't worry, mate. I'm sure you'll use your other talents to make money.
So anyway, the tax-free cash lump sums are usually included in the tax-free cash payments, or pension commencement lump sum as the fancy term. So if you take a pension income withdrawal of 75% taxable income, the rest of 25% is tax-free cash, and that's the 25% tax-free cash that goes off your lump sum allowance. So let's go over some really simple examples. Let's say you have a pension pot and you take 100 grand from that pension pot, and you take 25 grand as tax-free cash and 75 grand designated to draw down. You've now used 25 grand, so your 268,275 becomes 243,275. But you might have asked, okay, what happens when my pot is bigger? So 25% over 268,275. What happens if I'm really fortunate and actually a quarter of my pot is bigger than that amount? Well, there happens to be a new type of lump sum payment called Pension Commencement Excess Lump Sum from the great minds that brought you BCE, UF+, and a load more confusing nonsense that keeps me in a job. Anywho, when this happens, the lump sum element is subject to income tax. So that sounds simple enough, but let's dive into some transitional rules as we go through kind of the old regime to the new one and the quirky bits. Now, the way the old rules worked in relation to the lifetime allowance was there was either 25% of the fund for a money purchase scheme, a slightly different calculation for a defined benefit. And here's the bit that's really crucial. When you worked out how much tax-free cash you could take, it was actually only 25% of the lifetime allowance remaining. And what was really big about this is that when you took a defined benefit scheme on the old rules, it was tested against your lifetime allowance and they times the pension value by 20. And what this meant is that if you'd used up more than your lifetime allowance through taking that defined benefit scheme, then often it reduced your tax-free cash. So let me just go through an example. And this is the old rules, but it's important to understand the distinction. Let's just assume for this, the lifetime allowance is 1 million, which it was at some point. And let's say John, at that point, took a defined benefit pension with £40,000. That basically means that John would have used 80% of his lifetime allowance at the time, because 40,000 times 20 is 800,000, and 800,000 of a million is 80%, so 20% left. And let's say he took just the full pension and no tax-free cash. That means that you've now got £200,000 left of your £1 million lifetime allowance at the time. But on the old rules, because the tax-free cash was 25% of your remaining lifetime allowance, despite the fact that John in that example had not actually taken a pound of tax-free cash, he was only entitled to 1/4 of 200,000 or £50,000 tax-free cash. So despite the fact that there's £250,000 potential tax-free cash, he'd only be able to take 50 because he took his defined benefit scheme first. So what happens in the new regime, and what happens if you're in a position like John, where you'd taken schemes in a certain way, but you'd actually not used your full tax-free cash, or lump sum allowance as it's called? Well, there's actually a default transitional rule in place, which effectively means that if your lump sum allowance, again, assuming no protections, you have to bear with me on that caveat, is 268,275, and you've actually taken less, you have the ability to potentially go to a scheme and request what's called a transitional certificate to show that you potentially have higher lump sums available. There is a big problem here though. You have to have that transitional certificate in place before your first point of taking any other benefits after the 6th of April 2024. So let's say you're someone who's taking, let's say somehow that applies to you and you're taking regular income. You need to have that transitional protection certificate in place if it's relevant and you need to claim before the next benefit crystallization event after the 6th of April 2024. That sounds like an administration nightmare. And honestly, I think loads of people could potentially get caught out. The only kind of saving grace is that probably most people won't be affected by this kind of stuff. So one thing to note is that if you've already used 100% of your lifetime allowance, then your lump sum allowance is now 0. Any of these issues are somewhat relevant to you. This really is starting to get into the deep end for complexity in financial planning, so I would strongly suggest getting advice. And actually, for that reason, give this a watch. Do you feel secure? I haven't touched the lump sum death benefit allowance. What are the rules here? Okay, so when a pension scheme member dies, the idea of only testing lump sums does continue. And what this means is only lump sum death benefits paid out to beneficiaries are tested against the lump sum death benefit allowance, which is still 1,073,100. Any death benefits paid as a beneficiary pension, for example, aren't tested. So what they do is when they calculate the lump sum death benefit allowance, any standalone tax-free cash, so maybe taking 100 grand to clear your mortgage or whatever, or also any serious ill health payments, which probably won't apply for most people, and any tax-free cash, maybe of what you potentially withdrawn as a lump sum. The thing is, if your scheme has rules that can only pay out the lump sum after 75, the big thing to watch out for is the recipient could potentially have the whole pension, the lump sum, taxable at their marginal income rate at 1 year. So what would I suggest here? It's just a case of finding out. Check your death benefit options on your pension and see if you have the option to potentially allocate to drawdown on death or annuities. And that could potentially avoid a big hit on tax for your beneficiaries. So two of the big things that you can have a look for is, okay, does the scheme give full flexibility on death benefits? What are my death benefit options? And also, are my nominations up to date? The reason why that's so important is sometimes if a nomination isn't put in place, it can limit the death benefit options that are available to trustees. Okay, the final thing I'm going to mention in this video, I did mention it in the intro. I was super on the fence about even mentioning this, but it felt like someone would put it in the comments, and I thought, well, it is a big change, so I should probably mention it. I cannot stress this enough. If you are considering anything like moving your pension overseas, please speak with a reputable, regulated individual and research this very carefully. I think it is fair for me to say that the regulation overseas in relation to advisors is not on the same level as the UK, as a generalisation. Okay, with all that said, here we go. Under the rules, in transferring to a cure-ops, a qualified recognised overseas pension scheme, it seems under this legislation that it doesn't reduce either your lump sum or lump sum death benefit allowance, and there's actually a separate overseas transfer allowance. So unless they change things, your overseas transfer allowance doesn't seem to use your lifetime limit like it used to under what was called Benefit Crystallisation 8. So this means, theoretically, it's possible for those with big pensions to potentially have tax-free cash of 25% on an overseas lump sum allowance and also 25% of a UK allowance. And this seems really generous. So let's say, you had £2 million. It seems somewhat possible that you could split that via the new overseas transfer allowance, transfer to a cure-ops, and then potentially get higher tax-free cash, because the overseas allowance will be equal to the level of individual lump sum and death benefit allowance. And I am really quite surprised about this, but do not take that as gospel. Please ensure you get very specific advice to you before taking any action. And anyway, that is an overview, a high-level overview admittedly, but that's as much technical as I think all of us can stomach for one video. The thing that I do want to leave you with is, whenever these pension changes are made, it's not making a change and then we're done. There's always transitional rules, knock-on effects. There's probably things that are going to get tweaked by current and future governments. So from an advisor's perspective, there's only really one thing I can promise you. Simplification is never simple. Thanks so much for watching. Hope to see you next time.